Hello, how are y'all today? It's kind of blustery outside. I hope we don't lose power or have trouble due to storms that could hit us this afternoon. If that's the case, just be patient and I'll try to sign back in. But if I lose power, what can we do? At any rate, we need to discuss federalism. And it is interesting that the president is giving a State of the Union address tonight because, first of all, that's a constitutionally required aspect of the president. He is tasked with giving a State of the Union address from time to time. Normally, what that means is he has to give an annual address. And does that mean that he has to verbally give that address? Actually, no. Thomas Jefferson always wrote his out longhand and mailed it to Congress. He did not like speaking before Congress, and so he didn't. But now, with the advent of television, it's a pretty hot date in D.C. to go to the State of the Union address. It's televised, and that way people can, make a comment for the folks back home by appearing, but it gets their hair done, a new tie, that sort of thing. And so the president's required to give this State of the Union address. Like I said, though, he could write it out, but with television, they show up for it. And what he's doing in this address, and since he will be running for re-election next year, no, I don't know that, but yes, I do know that. And it would be highly unusual, if not downright startling, if he said tonight, "Oh, by the way, I'm not running." He's not going to say that. And he is going to run. But what he's going to do tonight is sort of lay out an agenda that is federalism. Federalism is the relationship between the national government and the states and between the states. And that is expressed usually in two ways, financially or legally. And so tonight, Biden's going to say, well, these are the things that my administration has accomplished in the last 2 years. And frankly, y'all, it's by anybody's judgment, by anybody's standard, a rather impressive list. It's the largest legislative packages since FDR, in some respects, at least larger than LBJ or the Clinton administration in some respects. And so what does this mean? Biden has had a difficult time communicating that his administration has done as much, has accomplished as much as it has. But that's a political problem. It's not a governmental problem. What he will be doing is working on that messaging tonight by talking about his government's relationship to the states, to individuals. Things like infrastructure, where the federal government is taxing people to pay for infrastructure. What is that? Roads, bridges, airports, capital improvements, highways. Those things are infrastructure. Any kind of federal spending could be considered infrastructure. We tend to think of it in terms of more concrete things like highways, roads, bridges, airports, hydroelectric dams, power plants, those kinds of things. That's infrastructure. And he will be talking about those kinds of ideas and plans and things that his administration has accomplished. He will be messaging that it's important for Americans to give his administration another term so that they can accomplish more. Let me say this. What Biden will be doing tonight is not unusual because presidents are constantly engaged in campaigning in the next election. It never stops. It's known as the permanent presidency, or rather, let me strike that, as the permanent campaign. Campaigning is any time they make a public appearance in an attempt to persuade people to support their ideas and their agendas. So the president tonight, and you should watch the State of the Union address because it's important, it's historic, it always is. They outline what they want to do by talking about what they have accomplished. And the accomplishments of this administration have been largely a reflection of trying to course correct from the previous administrations. All administrations are a reaction to previous administrations. Okay, so yes, the president has this message, and what is he encapsulating? He's talking about what his administration has accomplished with regard to finances, that financial relationship between the federal government and the states, and he will be addressing public policy as law in that relationship between the federal government and the states' relationship with each other. I think last time we may have mentioned that the federal government is tasked with the responsibility of the concept of federalism. And every administration embarks on this. Sometimes they have catchy names, largely because the press gives it to them. The press focused on President Roosevelt saying that he promised the American people a New Deal. And so you have New Deal legislation and an approach to federalism where, it's pretty simplistic, but you can divide Democrats' approach to federalism and Republicans' approach to federalism. They're very different concepts, very different ideas, but simplistically speaking, they could be characterized that way. And so, American federalism is a good chapter in your American book to pay attention to. Remember, too, that states have a relationship with each other, that states are required to give the full faith and credit. Hang on a second. Be quiet, okay? They're trying to listen. States have a duty, a constitutionally bound duty, to give full faith and credit to the actions, the legal actions of every other state. So if you're married in Texas, you're married in all 50 states. If you're married in New York, you're married in all 50 states. And it's one of the easily stated, clearly written aspects of the Constitution in Article 4, which deals with federalism. States are required to give the full faith and credit to each other for the legal actions of each other. So if you have custody of your children in Texas, you have custody of your children in all states. Okay? Marriage has typically been defined by the states. For instance, Texas recognizes common law marriage, but California does not. And so if a couple is common law married in Texas and goes out to California and is seeking a divorce in California, California would say, well, you need to go back to Texas and get your divorce there because California doesn't recognize common law marriage. They can't give you a divorce if they never recognized the marriage in the first place. Now, this is interesting when we get to the concept of same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage actually grew out of conservative Republicans in New York who wanted to make sure that real estate which is the most important thing in New York, where somebody lives. And, can they get a good apartment? Can they buy a good apartment? When somebody dies, let's say that a same-sex couple a few years ago lived in an apartment in New York and one of the partners died. Did that partner's share of that apartment automatically pass to the person that they have spent their life with, that they considered their partner? Well, no, because they weren't married. For instance, here in Houston, here in Texas, my husband and I own a home together. God forbid he dies, his half of our community property passes to me. And so I get the house. If we were not a differently gendered couple, if we were a same-sex couple, a few years ago, that wouldn't have been the case in Texas because no marriage was recognized, therefore no community property could be claimed. So New Yorkers got behind the movement to recognize same-sex partnerships as same-sex marriages. Marriage is a legal contract, y'all. Marriage is a legal concept. And so same-sex marriages took off. The question was, if you got married in New York, were you then married in Texas when Texas didn't recognize same-sex marriages? The Supreme Court recognized same-sex marriages, and that was very upsetting to some evangelical Christian groups who, I guess, forgot that in the Bible there are folks who have multiple wives. Were those not biblically, acceptable marriages? It's a good question. But the Supreme Court upheld same-sex marriages, and they used the Supreme Court case of Loving versus Virginia, where the state of Virginia had banned interracial marriage. Blacks and whites could not legally marry in Virginia and throughout much of the South. I can recall as a little girl when that Supreme Court case came down. It was about the time that movie, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy and Sidney Poitier, was released. I was about 5 or 6 years old. And when I was little, my mom and dad and I would go to the movies pretty regularly. Movies changed on Wednesday and Saturday, and so we would go to the movies on those nights. And my dad worked days and my mother worked nights, and so going to the movies with one of them, was a pretty common occurrence. And so I can remember coming out of the Chateau movie theater in Irving in Plymouth Park, and we had just viewed Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And I told my mother, I said, well, I'm 5 years old. And I told my mother, I said, well, that's how things are going to be in the future. Well, the future was Loving versus Virginia, and that Supreme Court case came down about that time period, about 1967 or so. And states recognized interracial marriage. Well, there are folks today who want the Supreme Court to rescind, to overturn Loving versus Virginia. And they don't support same-sex marriage either. And they believe that states should have the right to determine who's married and who's not, and who gets issued a marriage license and who doesn't. And this is a good question about federalism. Do states have to recognize the legal actions of other states? Well, according to the Constitution, in one of the easier to understand passages, Article 4, states have to recognize the legal actions of other states. I know people who have custody of their children, and when they travel, they carry papers with them that attest to that fact, so that if they're stopped, they can produce those papers and say, yes, these are my children. I'm not kidnapping them. I have custody of them, in case their former spouse wants to mess with them and report the kids has been kidnapped. She can produce those papers to say, no, I have custody of my children. So the point to this is, do states have to recognize the legal actions of other states? Yeah. Does California have to recognize common law marriage? Well, no. And that has not gone up before the Supreme Court. It doesn't come up very often. Not all states recognize common law marriage. Texas does. Louisiana does not. So that's been an issue that's been left largely to the states to determine. Okay. Any questions about that or comments about that? It's really an interesting area of marital property. Strike that, of marital family law, domestic relations law. So that's pretty interesting stuff. States also have to recognize the privileges and immunities of others when they travel in their states. And let me give you an example. Mardi Gras is coming up, and let's say you want to drive from Houston to New Orleans, down 10, and go to Mardi Gras. When you cross that state line, do you have to get a driver's license in Louisiana, to let you drive that week that you're there at Mardi Gras? Well, no, because Louisiana recognizes that if you're a licensed driver in Texas for at least 30 days, if you're moving to Louisiana in 30 days, you're going to have a new driver's license. The state of Louisiana can require that because, y'all, driving is not a right. It's a privilege. And so under privileges and immunities, folks in Louisiana recognize that, if you're licensed in Oklahoma to drive, then for 30 days you can drive in Louisiana. Can they charge Texans more money for gasoline because they have a Texas license plate on their car? No. They have the same privileges and immunities Texans do when they travel in Louisiana. Okay? Now, this is kind of tricky, and this used to be an easy question to ask, and now it's a little trickier. In Texas, correct me if I'm wrong, don't you have to be 21 to smoke now? It used to be that you could be 18 to smoke, but I think Texas raised their smoking to 21. Alcohol purchases have to be 21. You're able to vote at 18. You're able to get drafted at 18, but you have to be 21 to buy alcohol or 21 to buy cigarettes. It used to be that I would ask, if you're traveling in Utah and you smoke, if you're able to smoke at 18 in Texas, are you able to smoke when you're in Utah visiting your family there in Utah? No, because even though you're 18 and that's the age of smoking in Texas, you have to behave as a Utah citizen when you're in Utah, and the smoking age in Utah was 21. Well, now the smoking age in Texas is 21. So that level has been that age requirement has been changed. Alcohol consumption was 18 when I was 18. And then it was raised to 21. You know why? Because the group Mothers Against Drunk Driving really lobbied Congress to raise the drinking age. Well, Congress didn't control that. It was the states that controlled it. But they told Congress, look, why don't you dry up highway funding? And I mean, Texas has got to have that federal highway funding. We just couldn't make it with all the highways that we have just on money that the state raises. We have to have federal highway funding. And so Congress was able to say to states where the drinking age was 18, you need to raise your drinking age to 21 or we're going to cut off your highway funding. And states just fell all over themselves to raise the drinking age to 21, except, of course, Louisiana. And Louisiana said, no, come on, you can drink here. And Congress cut off Louisiana's federal highway funding, and the roads just were awful between, all over Louisiana because they lost their federal highway funding. Well, word got around, and so now Louisiana's drinking age is now 21. I still marvel at the availability of alcohol in Louisiana. You go in a Walgreens and there's hard liquor for sale in Walgreens, or Sam's, which in Texas, the Sam's located in Texas do not have the ability to sell quote unquote hard liquor, whiskey, bourbon, vodka, those alcoholic beverages. Beer is pretty ubiquitous. It's in your little mini mart convenience stores and gas stations. But in Louisiana sells hard liquor and mixed drinks like Coca-Cola and bourbon in a can in gas stations in Louisiana. It's a whole completely different atmosphere about alcohol there. Do I think that Sam's and those places are going to get the ability to sell alcohol, hard liquor? That's a very good question. Costco, has liquor stores, but they're separate from Costco's. They're not in the same building. And so I'm curious about this. The liquor stores don't want Sam's to sell hard liquor. So they lobby to prevent those licensing to sell hard liquor in places like Walgreens, or Sam's, or Walmart, for that matter. Okay. The liquor stores really don't want that to occur because they believe that Walmart and Sam's will undercut pricing for those goods, for that hard liquor. And that's an interesting point. That's a good point. Do I think that that'll happen? It's hard to say. It used to be that it was very hard to expand liquor sales because certain groups, particularly religious-oriented groups in Texas, were able to prevent that. I mean, I was fascinated that Governor Abbott signed legislation that allowed for the sale of alcohol before noon on Sunday. The thinking there is people need to get to church and then they can go to the liquor store, go buy beer and wine on the way home. But hard liquor sales stop on Saturday night. But that beer and wine, the availability of that is at 10 o'clock on Sundays. And so that's a pretty a pretty interesting change. It's also very similar to the anti-casino gambling and betting in Texas. You've got states all around Texas that have casinos and have betting and horse racing and betting. But Texas has been slow to come to that party. And some critics say, well, Texas misses out on that. I don't think that they're ready to expand to that on the level that it is in other states. But do I think it's coming? Texas's demographics have changed so dramatically in the last few years that you may see a push for that. You may see religious organizations lose some of their influence with the legislature, but I would be very cautious about saying, "Oh yeah, it's coming," because it's really a big mainstay of you know, blue, what were known as blue laws in Texas. Automobile dealers are open either on Saturday or Sunday, but not both days. Liquor sales are one of those things. It used to be, y'all, that you could not buy certain goods on a Sunday. And I can remember stores roping off certain products where you could not buy. You could buy a baby bottle, but you couldn't buy the rubber nipple that went on the bottle. You could buy milk, but you couldn't buy that nipple. There were laws like that. And the point of that was religious organizations wanted stores closed on Sunday. They believed that Sunday was sort of a family like that. I can remember when retail establishments were able to push through the legislature store hours on Sunday. But notice that those store hours are dramatically reduced. The church folks, the church lobby, does not want those stores to open at times that would interfere with church attendance. And so stores don't usually open before noon or before 11, right? Something like that. And they close at 6. That way people are supposed to be able to spend more time with their families. It's having worked retail way back in the day, it would have been good not to have to go to work on a Sunday, so that you could have a weekend. I mean, psychologically, having that 2 days instead of just one day and then a day during the week was a big deal. All right, so federalism, in your text, they have some marvelous, really marvelous charts and graphics that help you to understand that there are powers that are reserved. We call them reserved powers. Okay, isn't that convenient? There are powers that the states have for themselves, and there are enumerated powers that are articulated in the Constitution for the federal government. And I want you to look at the differences between these things. And there are some concurrent powers, things that both the state and the feds are able to do. So enumerated powers, only the feds coin money. You know, and that was a big deal under the Articles of Confederation. All the states had their own money, and it was worthless. And it really impacted. Hang on a second here. The dogs are bugging me. You guys, go play or something. You know, we're working here. So the states lost their ability to coin their own money, and the feds wrote that into the Constitution that there would be one currency and that would be the responsibility of the federal government and not the state governments. All right? The feds regulate interstate commerce and foreign commerce. The states are not engaged in that. Texas doesn't have a trade agreement with Mexico. It's the United States that has a trade agreement with Mexico. The feds conduct foreign policy. Actually, the president conducts foreign policy. Governor Abbott clearly doesn't, because it's much more headline getting, attention getting to ship people to Martha's Vineyard on a bus or an airplane and call that some kind of immigration policy, because Governor Abbott is not able to craft immigration policy or conduct foreign affairs and meet with the president of Mexico in any capacity other than a symbolic capacity. But no public policy about immigration or foreign affairs comes from the states, even the border states. They don't have that kind of authority under our Constitution. The states do not have the ability to worry about naturalization. The states cannot punish counterfeiting. The states cannot establish copyright or patent laws. They cannot regulate the postal system or establish courts inferior to the Supreme Court. The states can't declare war. They don't have that kind of authority. Those are all those are all enumerated powers. Now, state power, though, those things reserved to the states, they can regulate intra-state commerce. So these 18-wheeler trucks up and down the highways, and the hours that they drive and the speeds at which they can travel and the cargo that they can carry, that stuff can be regulated by the states. In Texas, trucking is regulated by the Railroad Commission. Okay? I know when you get to Texas government, you talk a lot about what the Railroad Commission is and how funny the name is, that the Railroad Commission regulates oil and gas and intrastate trucking. It's not the Intrastate Trucking Commission, it's the Railroad Commission. Why? Because 100 years ago, they regulated the railroads, and they lost that authority in a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court said, no, that's interstate commerce. Trains cross state lines, therefore that's interstate commerce. And the Texas lost the ability to regulate railroads. But they didn't change the name of the Railroad Commission. A couple of years ago, they got the bright idea that they would change the name of the Railroad Commission. But y'all, it would cost millions of dollars to change the stationery and to change the buildings and to change the state seal and all of that sort of thing. So, no, the legislature didn't think it was a good idea to change the name of the Railroad Commission. So in your text, it's really a good idea for you to take a look at that little box on there about what the feds can do and what the states can do and what kind of shared and concurrent powers those two entities have. And it's a wonderful look at those powers. It's important for you to take a look at the concept of dual federalism. What the heck is dual federalism? That happened in the 1870s. Yeah, we need to go that far back, okay? Where the states and the national government exercise exclusive authority in distinctly delineated spheres of jurisdiction. In other words, I want you to think about, you got your federal government and you got your state government, and they constitute a sort of double-layered cake, two-layered cake, if you would. I think the food analogy works pretty good there. It's easy for us to remember. Like the layers of a cake, the levels of government do not blend with one another, but rather are clearly defined. You got your feds, you got your state, and the two never meet, all right? They might share some frosting, but they are very distinct layers, all right? That's wildly different, y'all, than what we have today. Today, you have got much more cooperative federalism. Look at it this way, if you would. Cooperative federalism is where you have a shared system of governance. Okay? I'll give you two outstanding examples, and this will stay with you. Okay? Medicare and Medicaid. Those concepts are created by the feds, by the federal government. The creation of Medicare and Medicaid came about in the Lyndon Johnson administration. They're created on the federal level, but they're administered on the state level. The thinking there is that the states are closer to people and have a better idea of what's going on the local level, and on a level where hospitals are local and are important locally. So Medicare and Medicaid are administered on the local level. And so what happens is you get a little difference in how those things are managed. Look at Louisiana, for example. Louisiana, they expanded their Medicaid system, and y'all know Medicare is for the elderly, Medicaid is for the poor. They expanded their Medicaid system, covering everybody in the state of Louisiana, regardless of economic circumstances. Well-to-do people or people who are employed, they may have insurance, health insurance through their employer, or they may purchase their own health insurance through any number of companies that provide that, or what is known popularly as Obamacare, where you can purchase your individual policies of insurance. But by expanding Medicaid, even people who couldn't afford Obamacare, which those folks would really be quite in dire straits, because some of Obamacare doesn't cost people anything at all. All they have to do is register for it. But the point of the matter is this. When Governor Edwards expanded Medicaid, he gave funding then, or expanded that available funding to all of Louisiana's hospitals. Therefore, they have hospitals they don't have counties, they have parishes. Okay, that's part of their French and French Catholic tradition. So what we would call counties in Texas, they call parishes. You don't have the kind of hospital closures in those parishes that you do in Texas, where Governor Abbott and the legislature did not expand Medicaid. I see somebody said, I didn't know that. Didn't know what? About Medicare is for the elderly and Medicaid is for the poor, or that they're administered on the state level. All of this may be news to everybody, and it's very complex. My mom lives in Louisiana, and she is like really, really smart about Medicare coverage in Louisiana. Why? She works for a doctor, and she's 85 years old. Yeah, Louisiana expanded Medicaid. Isn't that Medicaid? Isn't that interesting? That way they kept their hospitals open. What happened in Texas is you have over 100 counties in Texas that have no hospitals, and they have a heck of a time getting medical care in some of these counties. They're even paying for kids to go to medical school if they will come back and practice in some Texas counties. So this is something that's funded by the feds, or I should say mandated by the feds, but it's administered on the state level. So it's really interesting about the patchwork quilt of federalism. And is this a state thing? Is this a federal thing? Now, I'm always fascinated with it in terms of law. And I think I talked to y'all about this last time, that federal sounds sexy, right? So people think that Tommy Lee Jones should be a federal marshal chasing Harrison Ford or Dr. Richard Kimball in The Fugitive. Well, I couldn't watch the movie because it had that flaw in it. Tommy Lee Jones should have just been a state police, maybe a sheriff, maybe a state trooper. I get upset, y'all. I can't suspend my belief system long enough. When they make a little mistake like that in a movie, it makes you wonder what else is wrong. So pay attention to, is something a federal law or is something a state law? And, back when President Kennedy was murdered in Dallas, it was not a federal crime to murder a president. It is now. But it was not a federal crime at the time, and it was a state crime. And it would have been tried in state district court in Dallas County. Oh, they could have moved the venue, sure, and would have had to have. But where do you go with an international, global tragedy like that? Well, you could have moved the trial to the panhandle of Texas, and had Lee Harvey Oswald been tried, one of the first things they would have done is try to move venue. One would hope. When Oswald's assassin was on trial, when Jack Ruby was on trial, they didn't move venue out of Dallas County. And so his new lawyer, Melvin Belli, one of the best trial lawyers in the country, the first thing he did was appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. He appealed Ruby's conviction on the grounds that Ruby had ineffective counsel. The first thing they should have done is move venue. And the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed. And Ruby was going to get a new trial had he not died of cancer in Dallas Sheriff's Department custody in the Dallas County Jail. Okay? So watch. Is it a law that's written by Congress? Or is it a law that's written by state legislatures? And it's kind of a fun little game where you can go, oh, that's federal. Oh, but no, that's state law. Now, sometimes it can be both. All right? It can be both. It's illegal, federally speaking, to rob a bank. It's illegal, state law speaking, to rob a bank. And so what happens if somebody gets convicted of robbing a bank on the federal level? Can they be tried on the state level for robbing a bank? Yes, and that's not double jeopardy. That is two different jurisdictions, one federal, one state, trying somebody for violating their law. I see that it's 2:50, and I've had y'all for 50 minutes, and that's about all the attention that anybody can muster for a lecture on federalism. Okay, so this evening, be sure to tune back in so that you can take a look at the study guides that I'll be posting tonight so that we can start preparing exam-wise. And it's important, by the way, and you might want to spread the word, for people to come listen to the lectures because we're going to be talking about Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 about civil liberties and civil rights. And some of that stuff is way complicated. And I need to hold your hand so that we can get through that and you have some confidence about taking on questions about civil rights and civil liberties. So on Thursday, we'll start talking about that. Okay? How do y'all feel about federalism? You feel pretty good about that? All right, now be sure to read, y'all. And if you have trouble accessing your book, let me know. But you can download that book. Yeah, confused about civil rights and civil liberties. I'm going to tell you something, Ms. Morales. It can be confusing. And I think, I do agree that I think that y'all, they make a lot of distinction about what is a civil liberty and what is a civil right. Okay? Civil liberties, y'all, I want you to think about this in terms of a question of liberty. If you're not in jail, you're at liberty. Okay? If you're not in the custody of the state, you're at liberty. Okay? I like that expression, right? I'm not at liberty to say. If you're out running around, you're at liberty. So a civil liberty, y'all, is about custody. What happens when you're in state custody? Or what happens when the police pull you over and want to search your car? That's a liberty question. Okay? So that's civil liberties. Civil rights, a right, y'all, according to our friend John Locke or our friend Jean-Jacques Rousseau, our Thomas Jefferson, a right is something that is inalienable, that cannot be taken away, or can it? Okay? In other words, do you have a right to practice the religion that you want to? Well, heck yeah. You can worship a Maytag wash machine if that's what you want to do. Absolutely. Within limits. If you're even in jail, you can worship the religion that you, even in state, I really like that, Ms. Morales. Even in state custody, you are free to worship the way that you want. Now, what kind of limits are we talking about? Well, y'all need to tune in and read that chapter about, religious liberty. And see, I use that word. All this stuff gets really interchangeable, doesn't it? Right? It's kind of confusing. I promise y'all, I will not ask you. Yeah, spoiler alert, no human sacrifice, okay? That's a no-no, all right? Animal sacrifice as part of a religious ritual, is that okay? Yes, it's permissible by law. Absolutely. Right? You cannot ban animal sacrifice. We got a Supreme Court case directly. Yeah. No, you're right. It has to be part of a religious ritual, and the animals have to be raised with sacrifice as the goal, right? As part of a religious ritual. We're not talking about, you don't sacrifice. No, now see there, that's a good question. A pet, like a dog, there are laws about animal cruelty. You can't just grab a dog and use it as part of a religious ritual because, right, dogs are not raised for sacrifice. Dogs are bonded to humans, okay? That's a different kind of relationship. But it is not unusual for religions to sacrifice chickens, sacrifice goats, although I will argue that some people have goats as pets. But you can't grab somebody's goat, okay? That goat has to be within the domain and control of the person or persons who would sacrifice it as part of a religious ritual. Animals are largely considered property, although there are laws changing about that. It used to be in Texas you could not leave an animal an estate, like you couldn't leave money for the care and protection of an animal, and that's changed. So our attitudes toward the value of pets are moving out of the realm of property and more into the realm of companion. And so that's a very interesting area of the law that deals with animals and pets. And, cattle have a special legal status in Texas because, the economy depended upon so much a part of that. So we're going to get into the big ones, y'all. We're going to be talking about religious liberty. We're going to be talking about, a liberty question of, can you detain people based on war and the status of those people with regard to the U.S. relationship to a warring nation. we'll talk about that, Korematsu versus United States, and what ultimately happened in that decision. We're going to talk about some things that are pretty darn complex to talk about. Talking about law that's based on what we call a rational basis. You know, is there a really compelling reason, an obvious reason for a law, like putting a stop sign at an intersection? That's a rational decision, and it's rationally carried out. Why? Because everybody needs to stop at that intersection. So having a stop sign there would be a rational thing to do. There are laws that fall under that rational basis, that it just makes sense to have those laws. Then you have the status of laws that meet what we call an intermediate scrutiny. There might be a really compelling reason for a law, but if you look at that and scrutinize that law, it may fall apart if the government cannot really show that there is a reason for that particular law or that particular circumstance. I'll give you an example. Airline pilots have a certain age that they have to retire at. Can the government show a compelling reason to have individuals retire at a particular age? Does that make sense? It's more difficult to have those laws. Will it hold up under scrutiny that the reason for it outweighs any kind of factor like discrimination, like ageism? Okay. And then there's the really tougher standard that can the government show a reason that outweighs anybody's specific rights? And we're going to talk about that in terms of Korematsu versus United States, which is a really important Supreme Court decision, because we detained Japanese Americans based on their race and the origins of their ethnicity during World War II. And can the government really show a compelling interest in doing that outweighs the individual's liberty interest? They did. And we'll talk about that when we get together next time. It's 3:00. Y'all ready to quit now? All right, let's quit. And I will see you on Thursday. Thank you. I want to reiterate to you that you should feel free to ask questions. This is us talking here. Nobody's going to be critical of you. This stuff is darn hard to grasp. We're going to be talking about, do the police have the right to search your home? Under what circumstances? Some of this may put you in a position when you're thinking about this of some unpopular points of view. And I just want to remind you that the Bill of Rights is for the unpopular person, the criminal, the person who practices a different religion, or maybe no religion at all. So this is a section of class where people often feel very uncomfortable and very confused. You're not alone, and you're amongst friends. Okay? Let's quit, and I will see you guys on Thursday. All right?